Frieda Borman was born to John Henry and Ernestine Borman August 16, 1916, in Hammond, Indiana. Not much is known about her early life. Her mother said Frieda was quiet and didn't like bringing attention to herself. In 1936, Frieda met and fell in love with a young boy named Keith Allison. 2 years later, in 1938, the two were engaged, with the wedding set for the spring of 1939. Meanwhile, she lived with her family at 1189 Burr Street in Gary. On October 29th, Frieda went missing. Frieda left home, headed to the state unemployment office located at 25 East 6th Avenue. This was right across the street from Gary City Methodist Church. Frieda wanted to re-register for work. She had been unemployed over a year, and she wanted to pick up an uncashed unemployment check. She never returned home. It was said Frieda's custom was to spend all day downtown and return home at night via streetcar. The family, including her fiancé, filed a missing persons report, but the police did not take them seriously. On the night of November 3rd, 1938, Martin Erickson, a 25-year-old farmer, was driving down a lonely dirt road known as the Griffith-Ross Highway. This road was a continuation of Griffith, Indiana's main street. The street was known as a lover's lane and barely traveled. As Erickson drove along, his headlights illuminated something bright green right off of the road. Curious, Erickson parked and went to investigate. Unfortunately, he found the body of a dead young adult female in some weed-filled brush beside the lonely road near a grove of trees. There was no great attempt to hide the body. In fact, it was in full view about 10 feet off the road. Her clothing was carefully straightened and relatively clean considering the area. Pieces of car upholstery were found nearby. There was no other vegetation disturbed by the body. Authorities concluded she most likely died elsewhere and was dumped at the spot where she was found. The Lake County coroner moved the body to Gary for an autopsy. The body was identified as Frieda Borman by her brother, William. State toxicologists and pathologists were called in because there were no visible marks of violence on the body, although there was a slight bruise on her neck. This bruise would not have been enough to kill Frieda. They could not determine if she had been slain or died of natural causes. Robbery was not seen as a motive for foul play, as her purse still contained $7.68. It was evident by the body's condition that Frieda had been dead several days. Investigators found fluid in Frieda's mouth and throat. They theorized that Frieda succumbed to complications caused by a surgical procedure she had recently gotten. Others theorized Frieda had been poisoned or drugged. Authorities then came to know that the farmer that found her, Martin Erickson, knew Frieda and, quote, kept company, end quote, with her. What that exactly means is to be debated. Investigators thoroughly questioned Erickson, but his angle turned up little to nothing of interest. Authorities then found that Frieda never made it to the unemployment office. Her fiancé was also thoroughly questioned. He had a solid alibi. He was at work at Sunderman Dairy on the day she disappeared and could not explain Frieda's disappearance. Erickson's headlights illuminated Frieda's green coat as he drove, which attracted him to the spot she was found. This coat was found by authorities neatly rolled up. Her shoes showed absolutely no signs of walking on the dirt road she was found adjacent to. Meanwhile, the Borman family were criticizing Gary police for not finding her. Police did not take immediate action to search for Frieda on the Saturday she was reported missing. They felt if their concerns were taken seriously from the beginning, Frieda could have been found alive. A police investigation was started to account for Frieda's activities between October 29th and November 3rd. 2 days after being found, Coroner J. Robert Dottie revealed to the press that Frieda Borman had been raped, but she had not been beaten or otherwise harmed. Not only was fluid in her throat and mouth, but in her lungs as well. Investigators theorized that she may have succumbed to pneumonia during or after being sexually assaulted. They also finally theorized the bruise on her neck could have came from being strangled. Police got word of a youth that lived nearby the Borman household. Frieda rejected his advances 2 weeks before her body was found, and the boy took it kind of hard. This boy was later cleared. Keith Austin was also questioned more. Since Keith worked so far away, the couple wrote letters to each other constantly. From 1937, Keith lived with John Sunderman, a dairy businessman from Maryville. Sunderman told authorities Keith worked at his dairy farm for $30 a month, $550 in today's money, and for board. Keith was respected and was above suspicion to those around him. Frieda would visit him twice a week on average. Keith last saw Frieda October 18th. She came to visit him at work on the farm. Frieda wrote one final letter asking for him to come visit her, which was mailed prior to her going missing. When Keith arrived to the family home on November 30th to conduct this visit, that's when he was first aware of Frieda's disappearance. He took a lie detector test, which he passed. However, police still suspected Keith to know more than what he was telling, but they also went toward him not being involved with Frieda's death. Another search of the dump site turned up a half-empty glass bottle laying about 150 feet from Frieda's body. Around the bottle was a green belt that matched Frieda's coat. The bottle was dusted for prints. It was also chemically tested and found to have once contained a poison. A handkerchief was also found. Theories then turned to Frieda committing suicide, in contrast to her possibly being a murder victim. This new theory was that she was suffocated by inhaling a poisonous gas that was contained within the bottle which was found. This gas would have destroyed the membranes in her lungs, causing induced bronchitis. This would account for the liquid in her lungs, throat, and mouth. Yet it was still unknown if Frieda did it to herself or was forced to inhale this gas. The gas was suspected to be chloroform or phosphine. Gary police got word of a man who bragged about killing Frieda with a gas gun in the shape of a fountain pen. This so-called confession was made by an employee of Gary Works. He said he punched a girl and then administered the gas. Police refused to release this man's name pending results from the state pathological experts. Also, 3 more lie detector tests were administered. One of the men was Dr. Kim R. Brooks, dentist, who had an office in Gary at 690 Broadway. This office was down the block from the unemployment office. The other 2 names were not revealed, but later reports said that the tests were given to her family members. Investigators got word that Dr. Brooks received a visit from Frieda the day she disappeared. Frieda stopped in to get her teeth treated. The exact procedure is unknown. Brooks allegedly administered an anesthetic before working on Frieda's teeth. The state forced Brooks to submit samples of his anesthetic chemicals to be tested against a poison bottle found at Frieda's dump site. It was theorized that Dr. Brooks accidentally gave Frieda too much anesthesia, which killed her, and then he dumped her body. This dentist visit was not disclosed by her family to the police at the beginning of the investigation, which irked all investigators involved. That December, Frieda's body was exhumed from Ridge Lawn Cemetery for more testing. Additionally, the family and Keith were subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury. The state wanted to determine exactly how Frieda died and who was responsible if it was determined that Frieda was murdered. The grand jury was convened because investigators could not determine a cause of death. Frieda had been raped before she died. She did not ingest poison, but possibly inhaled poisonous gas, possibly chloroform or phosphine. The grand jury ultimately failed to move the needle on the case, and the case went completely cold. In February 1939, Lake County formed its first dedicated homicide squad. The squad was made up of officers and agents affiliated with the county and detectives and officers from each major city. The homicide squad was a direct response to Frieda's death. Frieda's case was the one they tackled first. The homicide squad's tactics were a lot more strategic and pointed. Some old suspects were again questioned. One was the young suitor who Frieda rejected 2 weeks before she died. The boy had been acting strangely since her death. He had ceased communication with his usual circle of acquaintances and stopped frequenting his usual hangouts. Police saw this as suspicious but did not say if they thought he was guilty of murdering Frieda. In March of 1939, police revealed they were questioning Charles Austin, the 52-year-old father of Keith Austin, Frieda's fiancé. Charles was superintendent of maintenance at the Sunderman Dairy and at the Lutz Farm in Hobart, the same as his son, Keith. The new homicide squad's investigation revealed that the elder Austin was seen in a tavern with Frieda a month before she disappeared. Allegedly from unknown sources, Charles made sexual passes at Frieda. It is unknown if the two ever hooked up. Father and son were arrested and held without bond by the county on charges of murder and rape. Authorities alleged that father and son told identical, seemingly rehearsed stories about their whereabouts on the day Frieda disappeared, making them look suspicious. The pieces of car upholstery found with Frieda's body were allegedly attributed to a car that was repossessed by a finance company, a car that was once owned by Charles Austin. Investigators hunted down the location of the car and searched it for clues. Both Austins denied knowing anything about Frieda's death. Charles Austin said he was visiting one of his other sons on the day that Frieda disappeared, but this story turned out to be false. Police got no confession out of either Charles or Keith. Strands of human hair that did not belong to Frieda were found on her green coat. The hairs were tested in Washington, D.C. against hairs from both Austins. At the same time, two other farmhands who worked with the Austins, Ray Alder and Bud Fairman, were questioned by authorities. Alder was secretly jailed. Frieda's two brothers were both questioned as well. Dr. Brooks was also grilled again, but released after it was found Frieda went to his dentistry 2 weeks before her death. A woman named Verna Wildermuth and her boyfriend Earl Hine and Lawrence Russell were also questioned. Frieda was at a party hosted by Wildermuth 2 weeks before she was found dead. Wildermuth and Hine were with Frieda and Charles Austin at the tavern 2 weeks before Frieda disappeared. In another twist, authorities revealed Frieda's pneumonia was chronic. In the weeks before her death, Frieda suffered from strong coughing bouts. Only her young and strong heart kept her lungs from failing altogether. This was credence enough to totally dismiss the inhalation of a poisonous gas that may have led to her death. Yet authorities still maintained their belief that she did inhale poisonous gas. On March 28th, Charles Austin was freed. A couple of days later, on April 11th, Keith Austin was also freed. They had both passed multiple lie detector tests. The hair follicle investigation, which compared the hairs of 15 individuals to Frieda's hair, turned up nothing. J. Edgar Hoover himself stated that none of the hairs matched. The investigation, for all its tenacity, failed to find a single suspect that could stick. April 18th, 1939. A man was arrested and charged with the rape and murder of Frieda Borman. Let's rewind. October 29th, 1938, 7 p.m. A 35-year-old man drove home from his job at Universal Atlas Portland Cement Company at the northwesternmost edge of Gary. As he rode past his neighborhood, he saw a girl walking west on 9th Avenue between Clark Road and Ralston Street. He knew this girl. Off of the strength of their 2-year acquaintance, he pulled to the side of the road and asked if the girl wanted a ride home. The girl accepted, though the man had made sexual passes at her in the past. The man only lived 2 blocks away from her home. The girl got in the car. The man suggested that they take a, quote, fresh air ride, end quote. This is uncommon slang nowadays, but it basically meant to smoke weed. The girl declined, wanting to go home instead of hanging out. The man proceeded to drive this girl to her street, yet he drove right past her house without stopping. The man proceeded to touch the girl sexually as they drove away from her home. The girl refused all of his advances. They drove for miles until they reached a lover's lane in Griffith. As the man parked the car, the girl opened the door and leapt out. This caused the man to snap. The girl began to run. The man followed. The girl dove into a nearby thicket, threw off her coat, and fell into the brush. In an instant, the man was on top of her. He took out his member and forcibly inserted himself. As he began his selfish sexual act, the girl remained motionless. The man figured that this girl had fainted, but continued his dark, unwanted deed. After the man was finished, the girl still remained motionless. Concerned, the man checked for a pulse and did not find one. For over an hour, he frantically tried to revive the girl. All attempts to bring the girl back from the brink failed. Fearfully, the man returned to his car and drove home. The next day, this man returned to the site of his cruel actions. To his dismay, the girl still lay there, in the same position as he left her. The husband and father of 2 small children again went into a panic. He looked inside of his car for any evidence of the girl's presence. He found her coat belt. Grabbing it and a diluted bottle of antiseptic, he returned the belt to its deceased owner. He then rearranged the girl's clothes, straightened them out as best as he could to make it look as if she had simply fell asleep, and in a twisted show of respect, he closed her legs, crossed her ankles, and left the scene. And there, Frieda Borman lay dead and alone for days before being discovered by farmer Martin Erickson. The man who gave this incredible story was named Henry William Skirg. Skirg was arrested at his place of employment, where he worked as an electrical engineer, just 2 weeks prior by county homicide squads. They questioned him about his whereabouts the day Frieda went missing. Indications are Ray Arder, a farmhand at Keith Alston's employer Sonderman's farm, knew Skirg. Skirg may have hinted or flat out told Arder he was responsible for Frieda's death. Whatever the case, Arder did all but blatantly rat Skirg out. During Skirg's initial questioning, he seemed to have a solid alibi, so authorities let him go. However, with the possible layup from Ray Arder, they felt they had enough to go after Skirg a second time. Skirg had been known as the local child molester. It is unknown if the county was aware of Skirg and that sort of activity prior to being arrested, or if this was just a rumor floating around his neighborhood. When he was arrested, however, over 24 young children, their parents, and other various adult women from around the home he lived with his family came forward to accuse Skirg of various degrees of sexual assault. After his first encounter with authorities, Skirg suffered a nervous breakdown and was admitted into Mount Mercy Sanatorium in Munster for 10 days. As he left the facility, he was arrested. Soon after being booked, he snapped while in custody. Skirg was described as being a maniac. Allegedly, his mental disorder awakened while being questioned about the details of his crimes and his motives. It was then theorized that his visit to the sanatorium was a result of his guilt for murdering Frieda. Officials at the sanatorium called the new homicide squad and arranged for Skirg to be arrested as soon as he was released from their care. As such, the confession that Skirg gave contradicted the findings of Frieda's death investigation. Frieda was theorized to have been forced to inhale a poisonous gas. Skirg mentioned no such gassing. Instead, he insisted Frieda died as a result of trying to evade him. Experts determined Skirg's mental breakdown in jail was a hoax. It also came out that Skirg did not display any mental breakdowns at any time while working or being at home with his own family prior to Frieda being found. Henry Skirg was charged with raping Frieda, but not with murdering her. It was because there was a severe lack of evidence that Skirg was the killer. The confession was ignored by the grand jury, for they believed Skirg was actually insane. This pissed everybody off, as such things go. The grand jury also determined that because the case was so publicized, each step of the way documented in the press, it was not unreasonable to assume that one could fabricate a confession based on botched investigative efforts by authorities. The rape charge stuck based on testimony from a 15-year-old girl from Skirg's neighborhood which he allegedly attacked. It is concluded that Frieda Borman died from pneumonia, and there was no evidence she had been murdered in general. It is important to note that Skirg never admitted killing Borman, only raping her. After being seen as unfit to stand trial, Skirg was sentenced to an insane asylum in Michigan City, June 1939. That's it. There were no other developments in the case. Skirg was never charged with Frieda Borman's murder, nor did any other suspects pop up. The story died in the press, and the family was left with no justice. Henry William Skirg died in March 1971 at the age of 70. He was survived by his wife, Marion Chambers. Who killed Frieda Borman? We will probably never get that answer.